So thank you for joining us, Reverend Mariama White-Hammond. She was appointed Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston in April 2021. In this role, she oversees policy and programs on energy, climate change, sustainability, historic preservation, and open space. In her time with the city, she supported an initiative to set carbon targets for existing large buildings, convened a city-led youth green jobs program, and worked to embed equity and environmental justice into the work of her department. She's received numerous awards, including the Barr Fellowship, the Celtics Heroes Among Us, the Roxbury Founders Day Award, and the Boston NAACP Image Award. She was selected as one of GRIS's 50 Fixers for 2019, and Sojourner's 11 Women Shaping the Church. Born and raised in Boston, she began her community engagement as a peer health educator in high school. She was particularly shaped by her involvement in Project Hip Hop, Highways into the Past, History, Organizing, and Power, a youth organization focused on teaching the history of the civil rights movement and engaging a new generation of young people in activism. After college, she became executive director of Project Hip Hop, where she served for 13 years. She received her Master of Divinity degree from Boston University School of Theology and was ordained an elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In 2018, she founded New Roots AME Church in Dorchester. So welcome, Reverend Mariama. I'm gonna mute myself and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rob. And it's good to be here with you. I know I'm always wondering, I'm like, who are the people that have come so many times? It's just interesting. I would love at some point to pick your brain about how things have shifted over these many years in this conversation. And so, I'm gonna lean in, I'm gonna try to restrict myself to 20 minutes of talking, and then I'm really looking forward to engagement. I am a Black preacher, so I'm gonna put a little timer on so that I make sure that I do restrict myself to that 20 minutes so that we have some time to dialogue, because I'm really interested to sort of hear where folks think things are, what questions you have, what your work you're doing, and how we continue to walk this path together. As was mentioned, I am less than a year still in this new role at the city. But before being in this role, I was an activist working on these issues. It's something that's not in my bio, but probably pretty worth noting in this crowd is that I'm also a farmer. I am with a group of 10 of us. We own a cooperative farm in Loudon, New Hampshire, not too far outside of Concord. And so there's been an evolution in my own life. I won't talk about that too much in my remarks, but I started out my time in the soil as a gardener, and that really didn't realize at the time, but was its own, it arrived from its own need to do some healing in my own soul, and gardening and farming has really allowed me to rebuild some connections that are really sort of important in my own life. But I'll lean in and then we'll have some time for conversation. So I start this conversation around reimagining conservation with a recognition that we are in a crisis. Not a small crisis, not a slight challenge, but a bona fide, what the heck are we gonna do? It feels like the world is falling apart crisis. And I felt that way a couple of years ago, and then the pandemic hit, and then I was like, whoa, this is even crazier than I expected. I don't know how many of you have read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talent, my favorite two books, and really sad that she passed away before the third book could come. One of my dreams is to work with some folks to write that third book and imagine what Octavia Butler might have imagined. But the story is one of a young woman living in the LA area, recognizing that the world that she knows is completely falling apart. And it's set in 2024. So there's something overwhelming about the fact that I read this book about 12 years ago, and now I recognize that the time is ticking down to that moment. But it's a world in which children grow up not really knowing what rain is. It's a world in which a drug crisis has deeply impacted the country and created levels of crime and instability that make people suspicious of their neighbor. A world in which work is scarce and environmental crises have made it so that people are not sure that they can depend on the planet to provide for them. And so the story, and I won't tell you the whole thing, I do highly recommend that you read it, is of a young woman who says, this world that I'm living in, this reality that I'm living in, isn't sustainable. I've got to figure out how we're going to create something new. Now, I realized only a couple of years ago that she is a young woman who's the daughter of a minister, then who starts her own spiritual community. And I was like, oh, maybe I think she's a Black woman. And I was like, oh, maybe I love this book because we have a few things in common, because my parents are also ministers and I've started my own spiritual community. But the core idea behind it is one that I think is really resonant, which is that she takes a moment to look around her and says, rather than just trying to hold on to what is and see how long we can ride it out, we have a responsibility to imagine something new. And not just to think about it or talk about it or write about it, but to get on the road and figure out how we create it. I believe we are at a similar moment in which things are falling apart at enough of a rate that we need to not just talk about it, think about it, write about it, try to convince other people that it's happening, but we actually have a social responsibility to begin imagining something new. When I talk about how I see my work, I do climate justice, I do environmental justice, there's lots of different things that people use to describe my work, but I use the frame of ecological justice. And that's because eco means home. It is from the Greek word oikos, and ecology as a discipline, as a science, says, how do we study our home? How do we look at things not just by themselves, but in relationship to each other? The discipline of ecology says that you can only understand the individual pieces of the picture when you see them as part of the system and the community to which they belong. And so ecology and ecological justice, from my perspective, is the work of looking at the whole, the system that we're in, having a critique of it, and taking the radical step of reimagining how we make that system whole. Now, it's interesting because ecology, as I've already described, is the study of home, but economy is the management of home. It's very interesting because that's what it means. And to be quite honest with you, it's not how it feels when we use it in our colloquial language. In fact, for those of us who are pretty active around issues of ecology and environment, we know that economy is usually the excuse for why we cannot do the right thing, why we cannot prioritize those things which will ensure the long-term stability, not only of our planet, but more importantly, our ability to survive on this planet. I do think it's worth noting that we often say we're fighting for the planet, but the reality is she will survive. She has been through a few ups and downs before, and the idea that the planet is going away may be a result of our own folly, our own notion that whatever is happening to us is indicative of whatever is happening to everybody else. But the reality is, I believe that we are in a cosmic struggle in which the planet, who in many ways does love us like a mother, has to make a decision about whether or not she is going to keep this unruly hot mess child in the home or decide to put them out in order to save everything else. That is the question that we're in. We as a child, we as a species, often eat things from the refrigerator labeled for others. We leave our business in the bathroom, unwilling to flush the toilet, unwilling to clean up after ourselves. We move through all of the different rooms of the house, strewing our clothes left and right, not caring whom else has to move through or whatever the other resources they might need. We are the challenge, shifting ourselves, evolving ourselves, turning our economic structures into something that actually facilitates the long-term survival of all the people and the planet. This is the work to which we are called. So I do want to make note that I love the planet, but I tell people all the time, I'm not trying to save the planet. and trying to help her unruly child get itself together, the human race. And so I think as we imagine this idea that we need to create a new world, it's really important that we take stock of where we've come from and what lessons are important to learn in that process. I want to take some time with this community to look pretty critically for a moment at the idea of conservation, where it has come from, and how it might need to shift if we truly want to build a different world. I know that many of us look to, acknowledge, admire many of the huge names of the past in conservation. It's important to note there are folks who had to go to bat and had to fight hard and lean in to creating structures like our National Forest Service, to had to make sure that lands were set aside, that we did not try to develop and break down every single last inch of this planet. And that is a struggle that still continues. These questions of whether or not we will save and protect and really actually just keep ourselves out of beautiful lands in Alaska and in every part of this country and around the world is a worthy cause and one worth leaning into. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that the conservation movement has often come from leadership of some of the most privileged, who, in their effort to save land, have often run roughshod over the needs and the leadership and the rights of our Native American tribes, which, if we were really being honest about it, the idea that those who descended from the colonialists need to protect the land from the Native people who were doing a much better job before folks got here seems a little, at minimum, ridiculous, and in reality, also racist. We need to talk about the reality that in the desire to save land, what has often happened is the displacement of people from ancestral lands that they had been stewarding for generations to create hiking grounds and camping grounds for other folks. We also have to talk critically about the role of even the park system. So many of you know that I oversee the Parks Department in the city of Boston. And then this year, we are all celebrating the 200th anniversary of the birth of Frederick Lahm Olmsted. It is worthwhile to name some of the important ideas that he put out there that, quite frankly, I don't know if we would be where we are without his work. It's worth naming that Olmsted really championed the idea that nature should be available to everybody, and that we should not just save land in rural places that you had to have resources to get to, but that we needed to make sure that in our cities, we carved out places and spaces for those folks who were working every day to be able to promenade on their way home through a natural space. He was able to lift those things up on behalf of those whose voices were rarely heard in a time when voting was not available to all. And so it is really important to celebrate that legacy. He also has some important contributions around the ideas of native plants, of balancing between manicuring and allowing things to be wild. And I think he raised some important questions around how we do that work in a just way, not just to people, but to nature. Now, I know there are a lot of critiques now, and it's true that he probably at this moment was more on the manicuring side than we would maybe sometimes say at this point. But if you recognize the time that he was in many ways, some of the things he was raising about invasive species, about creating spaces that were more wild and untouched, were forward thinking for the time, even if we are probably having a more robust conversation at this point than in his time. And Olmsted was also an abolitionist. He saw a connection between how we value people in creating space for them and in the Industrial Revolution, and the fact that all people should be free. These are all things to celebrate. And we recognize that Olmsted also built on some of the negative aspects of the conservation legacy. In the creation of Central Park, probably his most crowning achievement, although there are definitely people that would argue there are other parks that are better, but he, in popular imagination, Central Park probably is the thing he is best known for. And very few people are aware of the erasure of the Seneca Village community, a relatively developed, but somewhat small African-American landowner community that was within the bounds of what became Central Park. And these people were completely displaced and did not receive any help to sort of reestablish themselves in other places. And so there is a bit of a contradiction of a man who is fighting for freedom from slavery for Black people while also creating a park in which freed Black people had been able to create something for themselves, had been able to become landowners, and were displaced from that space in order to make way for progress for everyone else. And so I just hope that we will have some time, and I'm nearing my time, so I wanna lay out a few other things, but I do think it's really important. I wanna note that if we do not name and grapple with our past, it just keeps coming up time and again. I'm also a pastor, and I do marriage counseling and family counseling. And a lot of times people come because they want to just skip forward to the good part where we ask, how are we going to do things differently? But sometimes if you don't take the time to ask, how did these patterns form? Who benefited from them? How are the relationships and the ways that we talk and deal with each other deeply connected to these histories of power and oppression being distributed inequitably, lead us to the moment that we're in? And if we are trying to create something new, how do we move forward in a way that does not replicate the mistakes of the past? I want to suggest that there are three elements I think we really need to lean into. And since this is a conversation about conservation, it's a beautiful thing that those things are 3 C's. But 3 C's that I think we need to really build as we reflect on the past and move forward into the future. So the very first thing I want to note is this idea of community. I think we need to be asking always the question, who is included, who benefits, and who receives the burden? If we do not ask those questions from the very beginning, we will make policies time and again that have unintended consequences and that replicate the mistakes of the past. There is so much need to build new, imaginative, and collaborative communities that allow us to create a new future. The thing that I think is really great about the climate crisis is that while we will not all suffer equally, we all will be affected. And it does create an opportunity for us to move outside of our bubbles and to have some different conversations about how we create a world that works for all of us. And so I want to really, really emphasize the importance of putting community at the beginning of the conversation. Sometimes this is a bit of a struggle within the climate community, the conservation community, where we have tended to talk about the land and to talk about the birds and to talk about the need to reduce emissions. All of those things, very important. And I do want to say that we should build a world which humans are not the only folks that we're talking about. However, I do believe that if we can't get it right with our own species, we have no chance of getting it right with others. And so we should not use our desire to include more folks and to include more beings into the conversation as an excuse to ignore or overlook or bypass the need to do the kind of healing within our own species that allows us to become and evolve into the kinds of people that can have those relationships with other species. And so the importance of community, I think, is one of the first. The second, I would say, and my favorite, is creativity. I believe that the world I hope to live in is one that sometimes I can't even imagine. It is one that requires me to base my life on ideals that I may claim to hold while finding ways to live out those ideals in very concrete ways. All of us have grown up in the system that we have. And so even as we may aspire to something else, we actually have to figure out how to live into that something else. And that requires adaptive creativity. I do want to take a note to say if we're really serious about creativity, and back to the community point, we need to include the voices of young people. I do want to note that one of the things that concerns me, particularly in the conservation space, is how it is a space in which not enough young people are moving in to replace those who are moving on. And so really thinking about how do we include young people as an opportunity to increase creativity, to allow us to imagine new things, and quite frankly, to include the voices of those who have not been as influenced by the systems that are, and therefore maybe have more capacity to imagine something different. And finally, we need courage. Now, I don't have to, I am preaching to the choir on this one. I know there are a lot of folks in this space who have done work that have had to fight, who've had to push back, who've been to more than enough zoning board meetings as we talk about what is needed and to make sure that our world is what it is, it can be. But that being said, I could not close this without talking about courage, because I do believe there is no way to build another world without having the courage to step out, recognizing we do not know all of where we need to go. But we are driven by a clear conviction that the world we live in is not good enough. Another world, as Arundhati Roy says, another world is not only possible, but she is on her way. So I want to share just one project that I'm working on that really excites me, and then I will pause there and we'll have time for conversation. I am in this space talking about conservation, talking about parks and energy. And as a Black woman, I find myself often one of the only or one of the few in the conversations and spaces that I deal with. But before I started my work in the ecological sector, and my own transition was really very much connected to the crisis in the Gulf after Hurricane Katrina. I spent a lot of time there. It really shapes my vision. And at some point I could talk about that if folks want to know more. But I've been asking the question since I've been engaging around ecological justice issues. I hear people talk about always how we could bring together the economic crisis of inequality and the environmental crisis of climate change. And in that, I've heard beautiful ideas about what is possible. But when I took over this role at the city, my first question is, how do I make this real? And I looked at a bunch of different things, and I talk about other things. I have the Office of Food Justice under me, and we've been looking at equity in parks and how we really invest, how parks become spaces that also are places that support people in the midst of heat crises and a number of other things that we need to do in order to make that real. But I have a heart for young people. I ran an organization for many years called Project Hip Hop, and it was a youth social justice arts organization. And we would travel every other summer. We do a trip to the South to study the civil rights movement, in which I got into 3 vans with a bunch of teenagers and drove from Boston all the way down to New Orleans, making stops along the way, and then back making stops along the way. And of course, as you can totally imagine, they never went to sleep when I told them. We always told them relationships that start on this trip never worked out, but people fell in love. Sometimes a couple of people fell in love with one person at the beginning of the trip and another person by the end of the trip, trying to get them to be focused. I saw the evolution of what screens are doing to our young people's ability to remember anything. But anyway, every year I think I got to the end of the trip and would ask myself, why do I do this? And then all the negative memories would fade over time. And I remember all of the moments where they had aha moments, and all of the times where we had joy, and the times that we jumped into pools together. But the purpose of that trip was to really study the civil rights movement, and was looking a lot at how folks in the South are trying to pivot, particularly named communities that have been affected by environmental justice atrocities. And I've been really, a central question in my mind has been, as we move this transition, how do we put young people, and particularly young people of color, at the front line to be able to be engaged in this? So as I moved into my role, I got the opportunity to work with another local city councilor, Councilor Kinsey Bach, who has also been looking at this issue, had been looking at this idea of a conservation corps, and introduced me to a program in Philadelphia called Power Corps. I want to lift them up because it's just really been a powerful reminder to me that the things that we hope and dream for are possible. On October 1st, I got to go ahead and visit with PowerCore. And I got there and they, the person we were supposed to meet with wasn't there because there was an emergency and they had to go handle it. And so we got to meet a young man, Aaron Kirkland, who works in the Philadelphia Water Department. Aaron, 6 years before we met him, had joined PowerCore, and he was a returning citizen, having gotten out of prison, and just very clear that he never wanted to go back and that he was looking to set up a career, a job that would allow him to raise a family and move forward in his life with a level of stability and purpose. He was in the early trainees in the Philadelphia Water Department's Green Stormwater Infrastructure Program, and now he's the manager of that program. And 70% of the workforce of the Philadelphia Water Department are composed of young people who went through Philadelphia PowerCore. PowerCore was created originally by Mayor Nutter on his way out, and they work with 100 to 120 young people a year, exposing them to green jobs in water management and in parks and park rangers, masonry, solar. And what they do is take young people, many of whom have never heard about these green industries, and from the very beginning, pay them to get out and do work that's needed in their community. They start with things like teaching young people how to recognize invasive species, which I got to see firsthand when I met with some young people who were working on a tree pit, but across the street from a rain garden. They talked about why they no longer use tree pits as an intervention and why rain gardens were better, but how you have to make these. And I was blown away, quite frankly, to see young Black men, most of them, I think they were 18 to 22, the young people that I met, talking about environmental issues at a level of technical expertise that exceeded some of my own staff in the Parks Department. And one of them particularly told me the story of how, as he was learning about sediment and the coloration behind sediment and about leaves and other types of things, and how they contribute to drainage issues, he looked at his own local park and noticed some challenges in the way that the park was designed and the way that the park was draining during heavy rainstorms. And he decided, you know what, if I just go out once a month and remove the leaves, I think we will reduce the flooding issues in the neighborhood. And so he does it once a month. Some seasons, obviously, as you know, there are fewer leaves that come down, but when leaves are shedding, he just takes a moment to remove some of that sediment to make sure that his neighborhood is safer when there are extreme weather events. And so I was blown away because this is exactly the kind of thing that I dream of. And so I'm really excited that we will be replicating the same program in Boston. We're really excited. I've already agreed that I'm going to come to the chainsaw training. We're going to be focused on urban forestry and park rangers, which is exciting because they'll be starting to learn about how we're managing the geese population in Boston. They'll be learning about tree management, tree pruning, what it can do to actually maintain the health of trees. They'll be learning about invasive species and working in some of our urban wilds. All of these are places and spaces where the city of Boston doesn't currently have the resources to do the level of maintenance that we need. And so they'll actually really be performing a service to their neighborhood while learning critical job skills that will allow them to move our city forward and move their own lives forward. And so with that, I'll just stop because I wanted to land in a place of hope. But we will, the second week in May, we'll be launching the program. I'm really excited. And I hope that this kind of program will be one that we see much more prevalent in the environmental space, as we really lean into the notion that we can deal with our ecological crisis in a way that uplifts those who've been deeply impacted by our economic crisis. And so I hope that we'll lean in. I look forward to your questions, and I can talk about anything from solar panels to how my spirituality plays into this. I'll pause and I look forward to the dialogue. Thank you.
That's excellent. So I think Reverend Mariama can do some of her own moderating, but I'm happy to help in any way. So there are some comments. I don't see anything that's particularly a question in the chat just yet.
I think we have a hand though. Buzz,
hand or applause? Oh, great. Go ahead.
Is that a question, Bud? Did you want to get us started?
Well, I would like to just give you a hand, but I have to give you two of them. But I do have a question. I do have a question. Yes, indeed. Nice to see you. Thank you very much for that inspiring and informative conversation. You started with the question of what have we done? How's it's changed over the last 32 years? And I'm afraid there are many people here on this thing who could at least say we were here more than 20 years ago. I'd harken back. You talk about Olmsted and of course, Charles Eliot in the same era as Olmsted were really driven by the need for open space and nature and people to get together. That was in almost 130 years ago. What's happened, I think, in the last 20 years, when many of us got into this field, we're trying to save land. We're trying to save land for bugs and bunnies and salamanders and endangered species. And you know what? We still need to do a lot of that. But thank God for some regulatory and some successes. We've done some of that. I think the biggest change in the last 20 years is getting back to the idea that people in places is part of our core mission, first of all. And second, that the open space is good for people in all sorts of ways. You know, we always knew it was good to make you feel better. We now know it's good for education and public health, and now we know it's good for the environment. Rolling that back to Boston for a minute, I think about open space and its impact on how open space has changed in culture, which I sort of just said. And we have coastlines and climate. So I was trying to get 3 C's because you're good with alliteration. But the question of what your visions would be on what Boston ought to be doing to get more people out. And you just did a great job on young people, and this program sounds like it's delightful. But there's more to be done, and there's a contrast among the need to prepare for the coast, to take care of the coastline, to get people to the coastline, and this housing problem we have. So to be down in the weeds, how do you and Sheila Dillon get along? Or really more generally for everybody else is how do you work on housing, open space, people, and equity?
Yeah. All right, so that's a big question. I'll try to tackle. So Sheila and I get along very well. And, you know, I'm really thankful because the Mayor's Office of Housing, which was formerly Department of Neighborhood Development, has been actually at the forefront of things like how can we do more net zero building and other sorts of things. You know, so I'm a believer that density makes a lot of sense. It allows us to sort of lessen the impacts of humans by sort of sharing a little bit better. And I think it actually creates an opportunity, if we are smart about how we're doing it, also to create shared open space. So I do think that there's a lot of, a lot of people make it seem like open space and housing have to be in conflict, but they really, in my opinion, don't. Now, lots of single family housing and open space do have some challenges. But if we could actually lean into greater levels of density, then we could actually sort of concentrate the people impact in a smaller place and then build a lot more open space around those folks in a way that's actually better for the people and better for the environment. Now, I know that's a hard thing to do. I think there are many cities and towns where the like commitment to single family plots is like, you know, people act like it came from on high, from the ancestors, like you must only have single family dwellings. But it's just not true. And it's not really necessarily better for our environment. So I do believe in transit-oriented density. I do believe in also really looking at mode shift and making that really possible, which again, if you want walkable communities, you can't have everybody spread out. It's actually better to have people sort of concentrate in a smaller place and then surrounded by open space around them that they can use responsibly. So I think that the notion that one has to be in a conflict with another is only if we try to hold certain ways of doing development that don't actually work. And they are not, it's not where we're going. And I think there's other reasons that I believe in density, which is that we need to reestablish places where people are living intergenerationally. I think it's ridiculous that you got kids over here parents in the height of their life struggling to hold it down. We send our seniors to live together somewhere else when we need that wisdom to be available to our young people. And then we can also help because, you know, I'm in a Butte right now. I broke my ankle 2 weeks ago. And so I'm really clear that mobility is a thing. Like when you can't get around, you do need help. And so I think that actually reestablishing more intergenerational communities and more density would actually help us not just sort of reduce our environmental footprint, but it would also help us reduce the isolation that is invading so many of our communities, exacerbates our mental health challenges. And it would help us with things like childcare, right? Like my parents barely ever had to ask for babysitters. And that's because we sort of grew up in what we called tri-family. They didn't like make that up, but the next street over, we had cousins, and a 10-minute walk, we had cousins. And so we just shuffled between the houses. You got home and your parent wasn't home, you walked the next street over. That allowed all of our parents, we had 6 adults, but sometimes one adult would take on all of us. I quite frankly do not know how they did that because there were 11 of us, but you know, we were all sort of close in age and they just tell us to go outside and run around. And we sort of like tried to, you know, take care of each other until the little ones thought they were being excluded. And then we were like, don't tell mom, you know, we have to keep you included so we don't all get in trouble. Those kinds of ways of living far more communally. I think that the nuclear family is a stupid idea. It doesn't work. It's not how we lived ever before. And it asks people to take on a level of burden and stress that's just not real. So I think that there's like more than one, from my perspective, when you think holistically, you can see more than one benefit to a shift in the way that we're doing things. And I know that there are a number of people in these battles right now. People have told me, right? Let's build a commuter rail and let's build housing next to it. And then people go, oh no, because then we need these trees around the commuter rail. Really? Let's make sure that by concentrating people near a mode of transportation that they can get around, we can keep more trees elsewhere, right? Like how do we think far more creatively? So I would say Sheila and I are always thinking about this. I mean, the bigger challenge we face is greed and the desire to make, you know, sort of super uber expensive housing that sometimes we have buildings that don't even have occupancy because they're like owned by like investors in Russia. I don't know, maybe they won't be able to own them anymore while we're in the midst of sanctions. But these ideas that we have empty buildings while we have homeless people, there's a lot of things about our land use policy that are absolutely crazy. So there were a whole bunch of questions. Okay, it's with my background in the art. Well, okay, maybe I should go to the top because I missed some of them.
I see the one.
So I think that we talked about some of what Joel said. You know, really rethinking in those zoning board meetings. And I do want to note a good friend of mine that I was on a board with, and he had a second child and he had to leave the board. And he said to me, you know, I feel bad. I want to contribute to Boston. And I said, you know, there are justice issues everywhere you are. And so he said, oh, you know, let's go. I said, well, what are the justice issues in Newton where you live? And he said, he realized he didn't know because he'd been, you know, he worked in Boston. He was doing all his work in Boston. He started going to meetings, sort of realizing these zoning boards, there's a lot of justice and injustice happening in those zoning board meetings. And so he was talking about all the coded language he was hearing in Newton around these conversations around affordable language and the need to call them out. And then he started going back in the archives, looking up Newton's zoning codes. I mean, if you go far enough back, you can find the time when people didn't care and they just say things like, we need to keep these Negroes out. I mean, you can find them often in your historical stuff and then say, why are we holding rules? Why are we holding laws that we can trace their original origin to be racism, to be classism, to be, we want these people to come clean our houses, but we don't want them to be able to live in the neighborhood, in the community that we're in. These things need to be overturned. And a lot of them are land use policies that we also know don't serve the planet. So it's this like amazing twofer. We can do things that make our planet stronger and that deal with these injustices of the past. All right, so is there a way to work with Boston Public Schools on a curriculum that would introduce all kids to nature, sustainability, and green jobs? So I will say that there is already a curriculum that deals with issues of climate change. Getting it into classrooms has been its own challenge. So, you know, it's one of the things that I'm having a conversation with the mayor about. We have a new Green New Deal advisor that's gonna come on, like how do we, BPS is its own ecosystem. There's many opportunities to do a lot of work there, but we really kind of need, and the Office of Sustainability that's already there has been doing some great work, but how we get it to sort of permeate all of BPS is a real challenge. And I think we are a pretty big and complex school system. Some of you may have also complex school systems. I know, Springfield, there are other cities that are not, just one school, but I think that there are real opportunities for those of you who have smaller school systems to ask this question of like, how do we get this to permeate all of our school system? But I do think it's so important. And so we are, with Power Core, we have been sitting down with some of our schools, particularly that have some meaning. So we're meeting with Madison Park High School, and we've met with Boston Green Academy to sort of say, how can we be a good track for your young people who are not going to go to college? So the Power Core is not for folks who are college bound, because that's great. And we think there are other opportunities for college bound folks. It's really for folks who either have graduated from high school, but are not sort of, many of them in these like sort of dead end jobs, retail jobs that like don't have a career path. And then also young people who have gotten their GED and need some help. And one of the things that's been interesting is we've been finding that there are paths that are so desperate for people that they're willing, sometimes people just say college degree, and you're just like, is this job, does it really require college degree? What would people have learned in college that is necessary to do this job? And just wanting to remove those barriers. I went to college, I had a great experience, love it. I spent a lot of money on it. But anyway, I don't think college should be a barrier if we can do a better job teaching people how to do it. So one of the things that, how we're shaping Power Core is we sit down with employers and we say, what do you need on day one for this person to be viable? If I can get you that person, and I can say, if something goes wrong, you can call us back, we'll help, because there's a whole bunch of social supports. Every young person has a social service caseworker and a career path caseworker, two people who will work with them on sort of like both, what are the things in your life, childcare, you don't have health insurance, what are the different things we need to help you do to get some stability in your life? And then what are the things we need to do to help you imagine what your career is and skill up to be ready to move in that career? We're not just trying to get people entry-level jobs. We're trying to get them in the door so that they can grow and move up. And that means, right, not just sending them with just enough to make it, but really actually helping them think about like, what is their trajectory going to be on in the long term? So, all right, Rachel, I see your hand raised.
Perfect. I was actually going to ask about Power Core, so it's a great transition. I'm really inspired by this. I think it addresses so many issues that we're facing, and much of what you just talked about. We have 26 gateway cities across the state of Massachusetts, post-industrial cities that are, facing a lot of the same challenges that Boston is, but don't necessarily receive as much attention always. And I was wondering kind of what you had to go through to get Power Core into Boston, and if you think that would be adaptable for some of the gateway cities around the state that some of us work in.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of what happened is, part of the reason I took this job is because the ARPA money was there. I just need to just be honest with you. When I met with Mayor Janey, I said, when Chris Cook, who was my predecessor, first called me, he said, I'm gonna throw something out there to you, and I just want you to not say no. Just tell me that you'll think about it. When he asked me to take this job, I mean, I had been an activist my whole life. I had never considered becoming a government official. At one point I thought about running for city council, but then I was like, nah. And I wasn't sure. So when I told Mayor Janey, yes, I said, I'm taking this job for the next 7 months. She said, well, but I'm hoping to stay and do it. And I said, yeah. But like, I need to be clear whether or not I'm any good at this and whether or not I like it. Right. So I think, we had a unique opportunity because there were ARPA funds flowing to make this happen. But part of the reason that I'm pushing this right now is that I know Senator Markey has been fighting for this conservation corps. And my understanding is that there is more traction in, while there were things people couldn't agree on about Build Back Better, that there were a number of climate provisions that people could agree on, and this was one of them. And so I do have a hope that there will also be some additional funds coming from DC to make this possible, to really grow this out. And there are other models. We did look at other models, and I'm not knocking them. This one just blew me away because of the unique focus on this particular population and the heavy focus on jobs. They only train young people in sectors where they know the jobs exist. And they do a lot of legwork to figure out exactly what young adults need so that when they show up on day one, that Philadelphia Water Department almost is sourcing from them almost exclusively because the people they get know what they need to know. And now they've got a whole network of support, right? So I want to get to the point where people go, I don't know, that student from college, maybe, but Power Corps, yes, right? But so that we are actually giving a leg up to folks who usually get the short end of the stick, because we've created a reputation that we make sure they know what they need to know getting in the front door. So I think it is completely possible for the gateway cities. I've had some conversations with folks in Lawrence on some food justice issues. I just think there's so many possibilities. So I will put my email in the chat if you're interested in talking. I mean, we're barely getting started ourselves, but I know that we suck up a lot of this air in the room. Now, I do not think we always get our financial fair share from the state, because people always go, oh, Boston's fine. So I'm going to say that for just a quick moment. But I also do know that we get a lot of the love and energy. And I think that there's a way to do this. I would love to see this be more statewide, and that we could have possibilities for training people across jobs, across sectors. One other thing you should know, though, is that I do know that DCR is also doing some specific support around gateway cities and tree planting. So there's a real opportunity. We are training people in urban forestry, but maybe there's a way to have some conversations with DCR about what you might be able to do. They have a number of jobs open right now. Our executive director, so we hired an executive director like February 14th, and he just came back from visiting Philly, and he said, he's like, when I heard it from you, like I was excited, the theory, but he said he went to a training, and he got to see them working with, chainsaws. And he said they use the same chainsaw that he has at home. And he said, this young, big hood guy telling him why he needs to wear his goggles, what are the things that could happen to him if he wasn't wearing his goggles, why he shouldn't be chainsawing in shorts, the purpose of the pants that they wear, and why it's a real safety concern. And he said to him, first of all, I realized I was doing it all wrong. I was like putting my chains on wrong, and but he also said, like, it just blows your mind to see, because the reality is people can do the work. People have the skill set. We've just created systems that stand in the way, that make it impossible for people to demonstrate the proficiency. So, this is, people do 1 year of work, 1 year of training. And it is worth noting that they are paid all along the way. So one of the things you want to look at, and I'm not sure which gateway city you're in, but what are the deferred maintenance needs of the city that the young adults could be working on, so that the city gets a benefit and they get on the job experience? Because that's part of what makes them stronger than other candidates, is that they show up, you don't have to teach them how to use this chainsaw, they know how to do it, and they've done it in exactly the kind of situation that you're going to ask them to do it. So the training and support is lower for them than for other candidates. And that's why companies, they work with private companies, they work with a lot of different, because people know that when they come, they're solid in their skill set. So I would love, I'll put my email in the chat. I'd love to figure out how we can help other cities and towns get this moving, because there's work to be done all across the state. Okay, sorry, I got a little long on that one. Okay. How has the city and state investigated the history of mass and acknowledged detrimental conservation impacts to community like Olmsted's erasure of the Black community in New York City? Not enough. That's a conversation we are having, but not enough. So as an example where we are starting it, and then I'm actually in a conversation right now with folks about how do we acknowledge it. So there's a project, for instance, I also oversee historic preservation. There's a project right now. I don't know how many people know about the Harbor Islands, but we have all these Harbor Islands that have been there. A bunch of them we filled in. So I go to Carson Beach and Castle Island, and we call it Castle Island. I'm like, but it's not really island, but it was, right? So, but there's still quite a few Harbor Islands out there, and the effects of climate change are leading to erosion massive, serious erosion in a number of our islands. And so the archaeology department of Boston is working with the Massachusetts tribe particularly to look at that erosion, to look what it will, and look at what it will do to known archaeological sites, and to work with the tribe to have conversations about what they want to do. If you know that this was a burial ground, do you want to try to recover some of the artifacts? Do you want to let them be submerged? What would it mean if some of it washes away and bones are exposed? How do we deal with those complex issues? And so that work is already happening, but part of my piece is that I don't think a lot of Bostonians know both the really ancient history of those islands, or the fact that Long Island was used as an internment camp, or the fact that Deer Island was a place where people were killed. And I don't think we know that history. And so I do think it's actually incumbent upon those of us who are trying to save that land and protect that land to also tell those stories, to be honest. And I think that could be an important part of dealing with that history. So we need to do more. And actually, like I said, my department is actually really thinking about right now, how do we present this project starting from a frame of, there's a lot of beauty here of people who spent, thousands of years ago were moving between these islands. There's a lot of trauma here. And there's a lot of injustice here. And climate change is now creating new levels of trauma. How do we hold all of that? How do we celebrate those things that should be celebrated? How do we atone for those things? And how do we adapt to the reality and they're tough questions. They're tough questions. We haven't figured it out yet, but we need to do more. And I'd love to hear if there are other people who are leaning in. Maybe there's conservation land that you have that was stolen from Indigenous people. They were displaced to create it. How do you love that land and then have real honest conversations? How do we have reparative conversations with local tribes, right? There's another site that we have called Sprague Pond, which people are wanting us to acquire and make open space. We now know that the 54th Regiment, the all-Black regiment that we celebrate, there's a whole bust across from the State House, camped on that land. We also know that Native people lived on that land. So the question is, if we're gonna keep it open space, how do we also acknowledge that history? Do we put up plaques? What's the appropriate way to name and honor? And we've already begun consultation with the tribes to ask that question. So yeah, and it's important, it's needed, it's complicated and necessary. Oh, more so than fewer carbon-filled trees. Density of development also leaves more open space available and fewer carbon-filled trees cut. Yes, total agreement. With my background in the arts and reference to creativity, what art, nature, open space, environmental, social justice projects, collaborations, or projects have you found particularly inspiring? So one of the things that's really cool is that both the Parks Department and the Environment Department are about to have artists in residence in this coming year. So I'm really excited about that. There's a number of things that I participated in personally. Larger things. So we also have the mural division as part of the Parks Department. And one of the things that they're working on is a project coming up really soon is to make a mural installation built solely from natural materials. So, obviously it won't last forever, but it will be something that people can see for a period of time. I think that we invite a lot of, particularly in the way we're building parks, we are trying, so many of our amphitheaters, which is what we're calling, and they are amphitheaters, they're there for performance space. What people don't know is that there are also really berms and bioswales that we're constructing to deal with climate change and sea level rise. But we've been trying to get creative. How do we build structures that will be ready when we have, water challenges, but the rest of the time when the water recedes or dries out, we can have great performances there. I don't know if anybody saw, there was a really great project that I loved. I'm trying to remember the name of it. The Nature Conservancy brought it a couple of years ago with a woman that works in smoke. Anybody get to see that? We're a few installations, mostly in Boston, but I think one in Brookline too. Anyway, so one of the things that was cool is that she created these smoke installations in air. Now it wasn't like burning smoke, it was more like steam smoke. And just really love when people find ways to use natural spaces to as like that they are part of the art. And we're trying to do that even more, particularly in Franklin Park and a few other places, like creating more opportunities for performance, for installations that are actually in conversation. One of the things we're now talking about in Copley Square, which is a heavily used park, and it does have some natural space, but there's a farmer's market and there's a protest and there are lots of different things that happen there. But one of the conversations we were actually just happening is to think about, could we include art that acknowledges the two slaves that Mr. Copley had? We've got a bust that acknowledges him. Can we, in more of our spaces, be acknowledging those folks whose names have been forgotten to history, who may have done, in some instances, more to maintain these spaces that we're talking about than the sort of great people that we know who, yes, they definitely purchased them, but my guess is they weren't doing a ton of weeding. My guess is that they weren't like out there planting and trimming trees, maybe, but there were other people who also did that work, who were stewards of that space. I think that another layer of this that we sort of haven't talked about, that we had a lecture for the Parks Department 2 weeks ago. A good friend of mine, his name is Kofi Boone, Professor Kofi Boone, who wrote as part of a book called Black Landscapes Matter. He and a number of other folks have been talking about the history of race and racial politics and landscape design. Talking about also, how do we uplift both through adequate pay and through more public acknowledgement, the people who steward our spaces.
Reverend Mariama, if I can just jump in and say we have about 5 minutes left.
Yep.
And I've just posted a link to an evaluation survey, which we'd love for you to fill out if you can. Also, just pointing out, some people have posted some cool resources, and you can copy and paste stuff from the chat if you want to save some of the things you've seen there. So yeah, and one question you probably saw it, but just in case.
Okay.
One, Diana Young points out what I think is a shared experience for a lot of our organizations, where they feel like they're made up of a lot of older folks, some of whom, and there's a real interest in bringing in younger people to their organizations, to their boards, to their volunteer, base. And she says they've had some success with stewardship volunteers, but do you have thoughts about how to bring younger people into these kind of conservation nonprofits? And also, I think there was a related question. Somebody else said, would it be helpful for us to provide kind of lists of some of the skills that we need as conservation organizations to, some of the new youth training programs that are being.
Yeah. I think that would be really exciting. I mean, we are looking at sort of big sectors, but like we're already talking with the Boston Nature Center. They have a few jobs that they hire, so that we will not train young people only for, the Parks Department, because the skills that they would learn to be able to work in the Parks Department probably also help with Audubon and the Nature Conservancy. And so we are also convening those groups of folks. I think part of what I was saying, I think is related to this, which is that we often have people that care for the land, and people act like they're like barely even there. They're not involved in the conversations. And so one of the things that I think we need to be thinking about it, and some of them are people of color who are just completely overlooked, right? I was talking to a friend of mine in another state, and I won't, put the group out there because they're probably a somewhat known group, but she was invited to do there to talk. They were talking about, we can't get any people of color, blah, blah, blah. And as she walks by, she notices that their groundskeepers are overwhelmingly immigrant. And it's like, have you talked to any of these people? Like, you didn't even, like, they're right here. They're people of color that you are employing. You have other staff in the conversations, but you do not have any of those groundskeepers in the conversations. And so I think the other question around that, and that's both sometimes race and class, and is sort of how are we elevating people who are already in the conversation, but whose voices are not being heard. are you talking with the folks who are in your janitorial positions? Because I bet you they know things about what's going on that people in the boardroom have not even begun to notice. And so I think the other layer to that is, I think there programs like Power Core we're trying to train more people to be able to enter into other places within the mix. But I do think it's worth noting that there are some people already in the ecosystem that are people of color, that are poor people, that are not being heard. And I think that the question is, are there ready-made opportunities to begin those conversations with people who are already connected? And I think the truth is that volunteering is a privilege that you have when you are paid well in whatever your main profession is. So some people asking them to volunteer is asking them to give you what they are not getting from the system that underpays them for their work. So I think you really have to think about it. I can volunteer because my salary allows me to do that. But some people cannot and should not be asked to volunteer because they are being undervalued for their time in other places and spaces. And the reparations that we need to do until the system shifts, we need to say, we will not participate in undervaluing this person's time when we know that it's happening in every other place in their life. So I think that's something that folks have to think about. I know it gets complicated, but we'll have to rethink our systems to make it work if we want people to be in the conversation who do not have the luxury of, doing things for free because the space where they already work underpays them for their contribution. So I know that we're out of time. Really, thank you for being here. Love to keep this conversation going. And, at some point I'd love, back when we're back in person, where you can, have a glass of orange juice and just talk about things, and that, intangible but so important human interaction. But I will say I'm thankful for Zoom in the way that it's increasing participation. So I won't knock it. But I'm sorry that I didn't get to fully answer the young people question, but really thankful for the time with you this morning.
Well, thanks so much for making a break in your schedule, which I know is very busy, to come and join us for this today. It was really wonderful. And I'm sure there's some nice thanks in the chat that you'll want to look at before you sign off. So thank you, everybody, for joining us.